Have you ever worked so hard that everyone assumed you were the reason things never went wrong, but no one thought you deserved the credit? That was me. I found out I didn't get the promotion the same way I find out about most disasters in my life, secondhand, in the break room, from a man named Gary who cannot keep a secret if you staple his mouth shut and hand him a legal disclaimer. "Congrats are in order," Gary said, not looking up from the vending machine, where he was locked in his usual death match with a bag of pretzels that had gotten stuck on the spiral. "Heard the VP of Finance thing's finally getting announced Monday." "Great," I said, pouring coffee into a mug that said "World's Okayest Employee," a joke gift from 3 Secret Santas ago that had, over time, curdled into something closer to a diagnosis. "Who's getting it?" "Chase." I want to describe, precisely, the silence that followed, because it was not an ordinary silence. It was the specific, ringing silence of a woman recalculating 4 years of 80-hour weeks in real time, while a vending machine pretzel bag finally, mercilessly, gave up its grip and fell. "Chase," I repeated. "Chase Bellwether. The boss's nephew Chase. The one who still uses a calculator app to add 2-digit numbers Chase." "That's the one." Gary retrieved his pretzels with the grim satisfaction of a man who has, at least, won one battle today. "He's very personable, though. Great at the holiday party." "He set the ceiling tiles on fire at the holiday party, Gary." "Great at starting the holiday party," Gary amended, and shuffled off toward his desk, leaving me alone with my coffee, my mug's increasingly accurate branding, and the growing, cold certainty that I had spent the last 4 years building a financial model so good it ran the entire company's forecasting, for a promotion that had apparently been decided before the job posting even went up. "My name is Lila. I am 29 years old. I have a graduate degree in accounting that I paid for entirely myself, a spreadsheet so complex it has its own internal legend, and, as of that Tuesday morning, a very specific, very quiet fury that would, over the following 6 weeks, turn out to be the single most useful emotion of my professional life. Harrow and Vance consumer goods manufactures, among other things, scented candles, artisanal soap, and a truly baffling line of wellness teas that taste like grass clippings and cost $11 a box, and for 4 years I had been, unofficially and entirely without a title that reflected it, the person who actually understood how the company made money. This was not an accident. It happened the way most quiet corporate injustices happen, slowly, reasonably, one small favor at a time, until you look up one day and realize you're doing an entire department's job under a job title that says senior financial analyst and a salary that has not caught up to the actual weight of what you're carrying. It started with Marv Bellwether, my boss, and, more relevantly, Chase's uncle, had been the VP of Finance for 11 years, in the specific, comfortable way that men achieve seniority at family-adjacent companies, by getting there early, staying long enough to become a fixture, and gradually outsourcing the actual thinking to whoever was competent enough, and unassuming enough, to do it without asking for credit. I had been that person for 4 years. I built the quarterly forecasting models Marv presented as his own. I found the 6-figure vendor overcharge that Marv took full credit for catching, in a company-wide email that used the phrase "sharp eyes" exactly 1 time and did not include my name. I flagged, 18 months ago, an inventory discrepancy so specific and so odd that I built an entire tracking spreadsheet just to keep an eye on it, on my own time, because something about the numbers had never sat right with me, in the particular way that a crooked picture frame doesn't sit right with you even after you've told yourself 6 times it's probably nothing. There had been other signs, too, in retrospect, that I'd filed away without ever quite connecting: Marv's habit of personally approving inventory write-offs that should, by policy, have gone through a 2-person sign-off, the way he always seemed to have somewhere to be whenever the annual audit came up in conversation, a full year before it was actually scheduled, a comment he'd made once, at a holiday party 2 years back, half joking, about how nobody really reads the footnotes anymore. Which I had laughed at the time, because it was, on its surface, a genuinely funny thing to say about corporate finance. I think about that comment often now. It reads very differently in hindsight than it did with a glass of eggnog in my hand. I had assumed, reasonably, that 4 years of doing this, quietly, competently, without complaint, while Marv took long lunches and referred to spreadsheets as your wizard stuff, would eventually result in a title that matched the job. I had assumed, in short, that competence was the metric. I want to be very clear, in retrospect, about how funny that assumption looks now. Andy's all-hands meeting confirmed what Gary had already leaked, with the specific corporate theater of an announcement designed to look spontaneous while having clearly been decided weeks in advance. Marv stood at the front of the conference room, hands clasped, wearing the expression of a man who believed he was about to say something moving. "I've been at Harrow and Vance for 11 years, he began, "and in that time, I've watched a lot of talented people come through this department. But every once in a while, you see someone who just gets it. Someone with vision. Someone who isn't afraid to think outside the box." Beside him, Chase Bellwether stood in a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit people who have never once worried about money, hands in his pockets, doing the specific, boyish grin he'd clearly practiced in a mirror, the grin of a man who has never in his life had to wonder whether he was going to get the thing he wanted. "So it's with real excitement," Marv continued, "that I'm announcing Chase as our new VP of Finance, effective next Monday." There was applause. I want to note, for the record, that I clapped too, because the alternative was standing very obviously still in a room of 30 people while my entire professional identity quietly detonated, and I have, if nothing else, excellent facial control under pressure, a skill that would, as it turned out, become extremely relevant over the following 6 weeks. Chase said a few words about synergy and taking the department to the next level, phrases that meant nothing and were delivered with the specific confidence of a man who had never once had to earn the confidence he was delivering them with, and then the meeting broke, and Gary caught my eye across the room with the exact expression of a man watching a car crash he'd already texted 3 people about. Chase found me at my desk 20 minutes later, leaning against the cubicle wall with the easy, proprietary posture of a man who had already, mentally, redecorated the office. "Hey, Raina. No hard feelings, right?" He said this with the genuine, uncomplicated cheer of a person who had never once considered that there might be hard feelings, which was, I would come to understand, the single most consistent thing about Chase, not malice, exactly, just a complete, structural inability to notice anyone whose life wasn't currently benefiting his own. "I'm gonna need you to keep doing the forecasting stuff, though. You're so good at it. I want to focus more on, strategy." "Strategy," I repeated. "Big picture stuff. Vision. You know." He tapped the side of his head, as though vision were a muscle he'd been training. "Anyway, I was thinking we could grab coffee sometime. You could walk me through, the basics? Just so I know what's going on under the hood." I looked at this man, 26 years old, 4 months into his first job that wasn't funded by his family, about to inherit a title I had spent 4 years earning the actual substance of, asking me to explain the basics of a financial model I had personally built from a blank spreadsheet, and felt something inside me settle into a very specific, very cold, very calm gear that I did not entirely recognize, but would, over the coming weeks, come to understand extremely well. "Sure, Chase," I said. "Coffee sounds great." The coffee, when it happened 2 days later, was its own small masterpiece of the genre. Chase spent the first 10 minutes explaining to me, unprompted, what a P&L was, apparently under the impression that he was teaching me something, before asking, with the genuine, wide-eyed innocence of a man who had never once had to sit with the consequences of not knowing something, whether the revenue number was, like, the good number, or the one we don't want to be too big. I explained, as gently as 4 years of quiet resentment allowed, that revenue was generally considered a good number to have be large, and watched him write this down in a leather notebook that had clearly never been opened before that exact meeting. "This is so helpful," he said, capping his pen with the satisfied air of a man who had just closed a significant deal. "Honestly, I think we're gonna make a great team. You've got the details, I've got the vision." I smiled the smile of a woman filing away a very specific memory for later, paid for both our coffees because Chase had, apparently, forgotten his wallet, and drove home that night with the distinct, settling sensation of a person watching the last of her patience quietly, finally, run out. I would like to say I spent that week in a state of dignified professional grief, updating my resume and quietly plotting my exit, and honestly, for about 4 days, that's exactly what I did. I polished a resume I hadn't touched in years. I had 2 extremely promising phone calls with recruiters who used phrases like market rate in a tone that made me want to weep. I had, genuinely, 1 foot entirely out the door. And then, on Thursday afternoon, doing the routine month-end reconciliation I'd been quietly running for 18 months on that inventory discrepancy that had never sat right with me, I found something that made the entire concept of politely quitting feel, suddenly, wildly insufficient. The discrepancy wasn't a discrepancy anymore. It was a pattern. 18 months of small, carefully staggered inventory write-offs, never large enough on their own to trigger an automatic flag, always dressed up in language vague enough to survive a glance, damaged stock, warehouse shrinkage, seasonal loss, had, when I finally laid them end to end in a single spreadsheet at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, added up to just over $2.3 million that had left Harrow and Vance's books and gone, as far as I could reconstruct from the paper trail, absolutely nowhere. I sat very still in my cubicle, the office empty except for the hum of the overnight cleaning crew 2 floors down, and read the numbers 3 more times, because the specific, cold water shock of finding something like this at 11 p.m. on a Thursday makes you distrust your own math in a way that 4 years of spreadsheet work should, theoretically, have inoculated me against. It was real. It was $2.3 million. And every single write-off, cross-referenced against approval codes I hadn't thought to check until that exact moment, traced back to 1 authorization signature. M. Bellwether. Marv. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling tiles, the same ceiling tiles Chase had nearly set on fire at the holiday party, still faintly scorched in one corner, a fact the facilities team had apparently decided was cheaper to ignore than fix, and thought, with the specific clarity that only arrives at 11 p.m. on very bad nights, this is either the worst week of my professional life, or the beginning of the best one, and I genuinely do not know which yet. I did not, I want to be extremely clear, march into anyone's office the next morning waving a printout and demanding justice, because I am not, structurally, an idiot, and because I have watched enough true crime documentaries to know that the whistleblower who confronts the fraud before securing the evidence is the whistleblower who ends up unemployed, discredited, and mysteriously locked out of the building by lunchtime. Instead, I did what I do best. I built a spreadsheet. Not the forecasting model, a new one, quiet, separate, backed up in 3 places that had nothing to do with company servers, documenting every write-off, every approval code, every date, every vague explanatory phrase, cross-referenced against the actual inventory logs from the warehouse team, whom I bribed with donuts into pulling 6 months of physical stock counts without asking too many questions about why. It took me 11 days, working late, working weekends, working with the specific, focused calm of a woman who has found something to be furious about that is finally, blessedly, not about her own hurt feelings, and by the end of it, I had built a document that told a very clear, very ugly story. Marv Bellwether had been quietly siphoning inventory classified funds out of the company for at least 18 months, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automated review, funneled through a vague chain of approvals that led, eventually, to a private storage facility 40 minutes outside the city that I found by accident, tracing a delivery manifest that had been logged under the wrong department code. I did not know, yet, what was in the storage facility. I knew only that Marv Bellwether had paid for it, in cash, monthly, for the better part of a year and a half, and that the timeline lined up, disturbingly precisely, with the exact 18 months I'd spent quietly wondering why the inventory numbers never quite sat right. I told exactly one person, and I told him on a Tuesday night, over a very large pizza, because I have learned, over the years, that certain kinds of terrifying news require carbohydrates. "You found a what?" said Priya, my best friend since college and, more usefully in this specific moment, an actual practicing corporate attorney who had spent the better part of 6 years doing exactly this kind of forensic unraveling for a firm downtown, and who had, up until this exact conversation, believed my job to be extremely boring. No offense, but genuinely I could never. $2.3 million, I said, sliding my laptop across the table, funneled out through inventory write-offs, over 18 months, all approved by my boss, who, incidentally, just gave the promotion I earned to his nephew, who set fire to the office ceiling at last year's holiday party and thinks strategy means having opinions in meetings. Priya read through the spreadsheet for a long time, in the specific, professional silence of a lawyer switching from friend having dinner mode into this is now a work problem mode, a transition I have watched her make approximately 400 times and never once gotten tired of watching. "This is airtight," she said finally, looking up. "This is genuinely airtight, Raina. This isn't a hunch. This is a paper trail with his signature on every single page." She sat back, and something in her expression shifted from professional focus into the specific, delighted alarm of a person watching a much bigger story unfold in front of her than the one she'd sat down for. "Do you know what's in the storage unit?" "No. I was going to drive out there this weekend." "You are absolutely not going to drive out there this weekend, alone, to a storage facility connected to a man who's been quietly stealing money for a year and a half." Priya said this with the flat, unequivocal certainty of someone who had clearly seen this exact mistake ruin an actual case at some point in her career. That's how people end up on a very different kind of podcast than the ones you listen to on your commute. "So what do I do?" Priya was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly on the table, and I watched her have the specific expression she gets right before she says something that's going to change the entire shape of a conversation. "Two things," she said finally. "First, I know a forensic accountant who consults for the State Attorney General's office on exactly this kind of thing. I can get you a meeting, off the record, this week." Second, she leaned forward, and her voice dropped into the tone she uses for the parts of a plan she's actually excited about. "How much do you know about Harrow and Vance's audit schedule? They're due for their annual external audit in 6 weeks. Marv's been talking about it all month. He wants everything buttoned up before the auditors arrive." I said this slowly, watching the pieces arrange themselves in real time, the specific, satisfying click of a puzzle finding its shape. "You think that's why the write-off stopped being small enough to hide, 3 weeks ago? He's rushing to close it out before the audit finds it." I think, Priya said, that you have 6 weeks, a promotion that was stolen out from under you by a man who cannot add 2-digit numbers without a calculator app, and a spreadsheet that could end his uncle's career, his family's reputation, and possibly, depending on how deep this goes, put someone in actual legal trouble. I also think, she added, refilling both our wine glasses with the specific relish of a woman settling in for the good part of a story, that this is, without question, the most interesting thing that has ever happened to you, and I would like updates every single day until the audit. Chase's first official week as VP of Finance began with a company-wide email announcing a brand refresh for the department's internal reporting templates, which turned out to mean he had changed the font on every spreadsheet to something called Comic Sans MS Bold, because it feels more approachable, and had scheduled a 2-hour meeting titled Vision Sync that consisted almost entirely of him describing a TED Talk he'd watched on a plane. I sat through it with the specific, practiced neutrality of a woman quietly building a criminal case against her boss's uncle in a spreadsheet she kept minimized behind her meeting notes, occasionally nodding at phrases like disruption mindset and leaning into the chaos, while doing actual mental math on inventory discrepancies I was not, under any circumstances, going to bring up in a room that also contained Marv. The forensic accountant Priya connected me with, a sharp, unflappable woman named Odalise who worked out of an office that looked less like a workplace and more like the set of a show about people who work in offices that investigate crime, confirmed, within one meeting, that what I'd found was not just significant but unusually clean, which she said the way a surgeon says a tumor is unusually well defined, as a compliment to the person who'd found it and a very bad sign for the person it belonged to. You basically built the entire preliminary case yourself, Odalise said, scrolling through my spreadsheet with an expression of genuine, professional admiration that felt, after 4 years of Marv's wizard stuff comments, unreasonably good. This is faster and cleaner than what most junior associates hand me after 3 weeks with a full team behind them. Do you have any idea what's in the storage unit yet? Not yet. Priya told me not to go alone. Priya is correct. Do not go alone. Odalise made a note, clicked something on her own laptop, and looked up at me with the specific, assessing focus of a woman deciding how much to trust someone she'd met an hour ago. Here's what's going to happen. You keep building the paper trail, quietly, exactly like you have been, don't confront anyone. Don't let on you know anything is wrong. I'll start the process of getting eyes on that storage unit through channels that don't involve you personally showing up with a flashlight. And you let the external audit do what audits are designed to do, which is find exactly this kind of thing, except now, instead of finding it cold, they're going to walk in and find a complete, documented, airtight trail sitting right there waiting for them, 6 weeks ahead of schedule, built by the one person in that building who actually understands the numbers. That's a very satisfying plan, I said. Is there a version of it where Chase also finds out he can't do basic arithmetic in front of the entire company? Odalise, for the first time in our meeting, smiled. I think, she said, that's more or less guaranteed. Marv, meanwhile, grew visibly, specifically tighter as the audit date approached, the particular tension of a man watching a clock he'd built himself run down faster than he'd planned for. He started closing his office door for calls he'd never bothered to make privately before. He asked me, twice in 1 week, with a carefully casual tone that fooled nobody who was actually looking for it, whether I'd noticed anything odd in the inventory numbers lately, a question I answered both times with a bland, cheerful nope, all looks clean to me, that I am, to this day, extremely proud of, because delivering a flat lie to a man's face while sitting on $2.3 million of evidence against him requires a specific kind of nerve I did not know I had until I needed it. There was one night, for weeks in, that came closer to unraveling everything than I let myself think about at the time. I'd stayed late, alone on the floor except for the cleaning crew, cross-referencing warehouse logs against Marv's approval codes on my secondary laptop, when I heard his office door open at 9:40, well past the hour I'd assumed he'd left. I had exactly 4 seconds to decide what to do with a screen full of incriminating spreadsheets and a boss walking directly toward my desk, and I spent every one of those seconds doing the single most athletic thing I have ever done in an office chair, slamming the laptop shut, sliding it into my bag in one motion, and pulling up the department's actual forecasting model on my work monitor so fast that I nearly opened last year's Halloween party sign-up sheet by mistake instead. "Working late," Marv said, stopping at the edge of my cubicle, keys in hand, coat already half on. He did not sound suspicious, exactly. Marv Bellwether did not, as a rule, sound anything with much precision, but there was something in the way he lingered, glancing at my monitor with more attention than he usually gave anything I did, that made my pulse do something I did not appreciate. "Trying to get ahead of the audit prep," I said, which had the enormous advantage of being, in the loosest possible sense, true. "Wanted everything buttoned up before the auditors get here." Something in his face relaxed, fractionally, at the word buttoned, as though I'd set a password without knowing it. "Good instinct," he said. "You've always had good instincts, Raina." He said this with a warmth that might, in another version of this story, have actually meant something to me, and instead landed, in the moment, like a hand closing very gently around my throat. "Don't stay too late." He left. I sat perfectly still for a full 90 seconds after the elevator doors closed behind him, listening to my own heartbeat, before allowing myself to breathe properly again, and drove home that night with both hands locked at 10 and 2, replaying the 4 seconds of the slammed laptop lid on a loop, and made myself a very firm, very specific promise that I would not, under any circumstances, let that margin get that thin again. I broke that promise, as it turned out, exactly once, 3 weeks later, and it would very nearly cost me everything. Living a double life turns out to be exhausting in ways true crime podcasts never adequately prepare you for. By day, I was the reliable, invisible senior analyst quietly building forecasting models for a VP of finance who genuinely believed quarterly meant every 4 months, patiently explaining, over the coffee he'd finally scheduled, that no, we could not simply vibe our way to a revenue projection. By night, I was building, cell by cell, the single most detailed fraud investigation the state attorney general's office had apparently ever received from a private citizen with no legal training and an unreasonable amount of caffeine. Chase, to his credit, was consistently, reliably terrible in ways that made the whole ordeal significantly funnier than it had any right to be. He renamed the department's shared drive folders using what he called vibes-based organization, which meant I spent an entire Tuesday searching for the Q3 budget file inside a folder labeled Big Energy before finding it nested inside a subfolder called Let's Cook. He presented my forecasting model to the executive board with 3 of my slides accidentally left in track changes mode, so the board watched, in real time, a ghostly cursor correcting his own verbal mistakes as he made them. He referred to the annual external audit, in an all-hands meeting, as basically just a vibe check from some accountants, a phrase that made Odalise, when I relayed it to her later, laugh so hard she had to put the phone down. The storage unit, when Odalise's contacts finally got eyes on it 3 weeks in, turned out to contain exactly what neither of us had quite dared to guess, not cash, not goods, but a small, meticulously maintained collection of vintage watches, purchased, according to the receipts Odalise's team recovered, using a shell account funded entirely by the diverted inventory funds, apparently as a long-term investment Marv intended to liquidate quietly, sometime after retirement, once the annual audits had stopped being something he needed to worry about. "A watch collection," I said, when Odalise told me, sitting in my car in the parking garage on my lunch break because it was, by that point, the only place in the building where I trusted nobody could overhear me. He stole $2.3 million from a company that sells $11 grass tea to buy watches. People do genuinely strange things with stolen money, Odalise said. I once worked a case where a man embezzled $400,000 to fund a competitive dog agility circuit. Humans are very rarely as calculated as the movies make them look. Mostly they're just quietly, specifically stupid, in ways that happen to be catastrophic for everyone around them. 5 weeks in, with 1 week left before the audit, the whole thing very nearly fell apart, in the specific, cinematic way that these things apparently do fall apart, right when you've let yourself believe the hard part is over. I had made, I will admit, exactly one mistake in the entire 6-week operation. I had left my secondary laptop, the one with the real spreadsheet, the actual evidence, not the sanitized forecasting model I kept on my work machine, open on my desk during a bathroom break, on a Wednesday afternoon when the office was unusually full, because I had gotten, over 5 weeks of successful secrecy, exactly 1 degree too comfortable. I want to be fair to myself about how it happened, because I have replayed it enough times since to know exactly where the chain of small decisions broke down. I'd been cross-referencing a batch of March write-offs against a warehouse manifest when Priya texted me something urgent enough that I'd stood up without thinking, laptop still open, screen still lit, and speed-walked to the bathroom to call her back, because the specific texture of "call me the second you can," it's about the storage unit is not a message you sit on for the length of a coffee break. The call took 4 minutes. It felt, at the time, entirely reasonable. It did not feel reasonable 2 minutes later, when I came back around the corner of the cubicle row and saw Chase standing exactly where I'd left my chair, head tilted, reading something on my screen with the specific, slow-motion horror of a man realizing a word he recognizes is attached to a sentence he very much does not. Chase found it. Not because he was looking for anything, I want to be clear, Chase Bellwether did not, at any point in this story, demonstrate the investigative instincts of a man capable of finding his own car in a parking lot without assistance, but because he had wandered over to my desk to ask, with genuine, uncomplicated confusion, why the coffee machine kept doing the thing, and had glanced, idly, at my open screen while waiting for me to come back, and seen, in Comic Sans adjacent horror, a spreadsheet titled Marv, full timeline sitting open on the desktop of the woman he'd assumed, up until that exact moment, was quietly, gratefully doing his job for him. I came back from the bathroom to find him standing at my desk, staring at the screen with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, not the boyish, uncomplicated confidence of a man who'd never had to earn anything, but something closer to actual, dawning alarm, the specific look of a person realizing, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that the ground beneath him might not be as stable as he'd assumed. "Raina," he said, not looking up. "What is this?" I want to describe the following 4 seconds as the longest of my professional life, because in them, I genuinely considered several options, ranging from slam the laptop shut and claim it's fan fiction to sprint for the elevator, before landing, with the specific clarity that arrives right when you have absolutely no other choice, on the truth. "It's evidence," I said, closing the laptop slowly, buying myself exactly as much time as the gesture required. "Your uncle has been siphoning company funds through inventory write-offs for 18 months. I found it by accident doing month-end reconciliation. I've spent 5 weeks building a paper trail with a forensic accountant who works with the Attorney General's office, because I did not trust anyone in this building to handle it internally, given that the person who would normally handle it is the person doing it." Chase sat down, hard, in my guest chair, and stared at me for a long moment with an expression I had never once, in 4 years, seen him wear, total, complete, undivided attention. "How much?" he said finally. $2.3 million. Give or take. He's been buying watches with it. Watches. Chase said this the exact same way I had, 3 weeks earlier, in a parking garage, and I understood, watching his face, that whatever else Chase Bellwether was, unprepared, unqualified, genuinely, structurally unsuited to the job he'd been handed, he had not, up until this exact moment, known a single thing about what his uncle had been doing. He looked, sitting in my guest chair with his very expensive suit and his sudden, total lack of confidence, less like the man who'd taken my promotion and more like a 26-year-old who had just found out his family was significantly more complicated than he'd let himself think about. "I need you to not say anything," I said, watching him carefully. "To anyone. Especially not your uncle. The audit's in 1 week. Everything's ready. One wrong move now and he has time to cover the trail, or worse, disappear it entirely before the auditors even get in the building." Chase looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, not into competence, exactly, that would have been asking too much of one afternoon, but into something I recognized, uncomfortably, as genuine decency, the specific, surprised decency of a man discovering, later than most people, that he actually had some. "Okay," he said. "I won't say anything." "But Raina," he stood up, straightening his jacket with the automatic, uncertain gesture of a man trying to reassemble his own composure, "when this happens. When the audit happens. I want you to know I'm not going to try to take credit for this. Whatever's about to happen to my uncle, I know exactly whose work this actually is, and it isn't mine, and it never was." I looked at him, genuinely looked at him, for what felt like the first time in 6 weeks of quiet, contained fury, and found, to my own considerable surprise, that I believed him. The audit arrived on a Tuesday, which felt, in retrospect, thematically appropriate, given that the entire disaster had started on a Tuesday 6 weeks earlier with Gary and a bag of stuck pretzels. 3 auditors from an outside firm arrived at 9 a.m., all crisp blazers and rolling laptop bags, and were installed in the largest conference room with the specific, ominous efficiency of people who did this for a living and had, over the years, developed a very keen nose for companies that were about to have a bad day. Marv, I noticed, had worn his best suit, the one he reserved for board meetings and client dinners, and had spent the morning walking the floor with the forced, over-bright cheer of a man rehearsing calm. I had, at Odalise's specific instruction, done nothing differently that morning. I sat at my desk. I answered emails. I built a forecasting model for a product line Chase had renamed, in a fit of vibes-based enthusiasm, from seasonal candle collection to cozy era, and waited, with the specific, contained patience of a woman who has spent 6 weeks building toward exactly this hour, for the auditors to reach the inventory files. It took until 11:40. I know this because I was watching the clock with the specific, obsessive attention of a woman who had genuinely stopped being able to focus on anything else, and because at 11:41, one of the auditors, a woman named Deborah with the flat, unimpressed energy of someone who had seen every trick a nervous VP could try, knocked on the open door of the conference room where Marv was, by that point, doing his 4th consecutive lap of forced small talk with anyone who'd make eye contact. And said, in a voice that carried clearly across the entire open floor plan, "Mr. Bellwether, we're going to need you to come explain some inventory write-offs." I want to be honest and say that I did not, at that moment, feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, a very specific, very quiet stillness, the particular calm that arrives after you've been holding your breath for 6 weeks and finally get to let it out. What happened over the following 2 hours, relayed to me afterward in pieces by Odalise, who had been quietly present as a consulting party by that point, and confirmed, later, in painstaking detail by Priya, who got the entire story secondhand from Odalise and told it to me over a bottle of wine with the specific relish of a woman who had been waiting 6 weeks for exactly this payoff, went roughly as follows. Marv attempted, for approximately 40 minutes, to explain the write-offs as routine inventory management, using increasingly vague language that grew more strained with every follow-up question, until Deborah, with the flat, devastating efficiency of a woman who had clearly reviewed every document in my spreadsheet before the meeting even started, produced a printed copy of the exact document Chase had seen open on my laptop 3 weeks earlier, the full timeline, every write-off, every approval code, every date, cross-referenced against the storage unit receipts Odalise's team had recovered, and asked Marv, directly, to explain the vintage watch collection. Marv did not have an explanation for the vintage watch collection. By 1 o'clock, Marv Bellwether had been escorted from the building by 2 people from HR and a security guard I had genuinely never seen used for anything more dramatic than confiscating an expired parking pass, carrying a small cardboard box containing, as far as I could tell from my desk across the floor, a single framed photo and what appeared to be a stress ball shaped like a dollar sign that someone had given him, presumably ironically, at some point in the last decade. I did not watch him leave. I found, in the moment, that I did not particularly need to. I had spent 6 weeks building the ending. I did not need to see it performed live to know exactly how it went. The company-wide meeting happened 3 days later, called by the CEO herself, a woman named Diana Conqua-Wexler whom I had, in 4 years, spoken to exactly twice, both times about parking allocation, and I want to describe, in detail, the specific pleasure of watching a room of 30 people learn, in real time, that the wizard behind 4 years of the department's actual functioning had a name. I want to start, Diane said, standing at the front of the same conference room where Chase's promotion had been announced 6 weeks earlier, by saying that Harrow and Vance takes financial integrity extremely seriously, and that the situation with Marv Bellwether has been referred to the appropriate legal authorities, and is, as of this week, entirely out of this building's hands. A ripple went through the room, the specific hush of 30 people who had all, over the past 3 days, heard 6 different versions of the story from 6 different sources and were now finally getting the official one. I also want to say something else, and I want to say it clearly, because it should have been said 4 years ago, and it wasn't, and that's on this company, not on the person I'm about to name. I felt my stomach do something complicated. $2.3 million was recovered, or is in the process of being recovered, because one person in this building noticed a discrepancy 18 months ago that most people would have written off as noise, and instead of ignoring it, or reporting it up a chain that, as it turned out, led directly to the problem, she spent 5 weeks quietly, carefully, and at real personal risk, building an airtight case, working with outside counsel, that handed the external auditors everything they needed before they'd even opened their laptops. Diane's eyes found mine across the room, and I felt 30 pairs of eyes follow hers. Reena Kapoor has, for 4 years, been doing the actual substantive work of this department's finance function, under a title and a salary that did not reflect it, and this week, she additionally prevented what could have been a catastrophic, company-ending fraud discovery, entirely on her own initiative. I don't think thank you really covers it. But it's a start. There was applause, real applause this time, not the polite, obligatory kind from 6 weeks earlier, and I sat there, in my chair, in the same conference room, feeling the specific, dizzy vertigo of watching a room's entire understanding of you shift in real time, and caught Gary's eye across the room, where he mouthed, with what appeared to be genuine, tearful pride, I knew it. He had not, in fact, known it. Gary had told me about Chase's promotion in a break room 3 days before any of this started. But I let him have the moment, because some things are not worth correcting. Effective immediately, Diane continued, Raina will be stepping into the role of VP of Finance. I did not, I will admit, hear much of what followed, because I was doing the specific, internal math of a woman recalculating 6 weeks of secret spreadsheets, 1 very stuck pretzel bag, and 4 years of quietly building something nobody had bothered to notice, into a single number that finally added up in my favor. Chase, for his part, took the demotion, because that's what it was, functionally, even though nobody used the word out loud, with a grace I had not expected from a man who had, 6 weeks earlier, renamed a shared folder Big Energy. I told you I wasn't going to try to take credit, he said, finding me at my desk that afternoon, hands in his pockets, minus the easy, proprietary posture from 6 weeks earlier, replaced by something more careful, more genuinely uncertain. I meant it. I think I'd like to stay on, if there's a spot for me. Not in charge of anything. Just, like, learning. For real this time. You want to learn accounting? I want to learn something, he said, with a specific, rueful honesty that was, I had to admit, the first genuinely likable thing I'd heard him say in 6 weeks. Turns out being handed things doesn't actually teach you anything. Who knew? Most people, Chase. Most people knew that. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and something in the moment settled into an odd, unexpected truce, not quite friendship, but something adjacent to it, the specific camaraderie of 2 people who had survived the same 6-week disaster from opposite ends of it. For what it's worth, he added, turning to go, you should keep the mug. The world's okayest employee won. I saw it on your desk the whole time. I think it's funny now, in, like, a completely different way than it used to be. I looked at the mug, 3 years old, curdled joke gift, oddly, permanently perfect, and decided, for the first time since I'd gotten it, that he was right. Marv Bellwether is, as of this writing, awaiting trial, having been charged with embezzlement in an amount that, according to Priya, who still gets updates through Odalise and relays them to me with undiminished relish, has grown slightly since the initial 2.3 million, as forensic accountants continue finding new threads to pull. The vintage watch collection was seized as evidence and is, apparently, worth considerably more than anyone initially estimated, which feels, somehow, exactly right. A man who stole from a company selling $11 grass tea, undone in the end by his own good taste in watches. Chase did, in fact, stay on, not in finance, as it turned out, but in an entry-level marketing role he discovered, to everyone's considerable surprise including his own, he was genuinely good at, possessing, it emerged, an actual, functional talent for the specific kind of bright, uncomplicated enthusiasm that makes for excellent social media copy. He renamed the Cozy Eric candle line to something that tested, according to his own internal focus groups, 17% better with target demographics, and I have decided, 6 months on, to let him have that win without commentary, because some grudges aren't worth the maintenance cost. Gary still cannot keep a secret. I have made my peace with this. I have, in fact, started using it strategically, on the theory that any piece of information I want the entire floor to know by lunchtime can be delivered most efficiently by simply mentioning it to Gary at the vending machine at 9:15 in the morning. Priya took me out for a celebratory dinner the week the trial date was finally set, and spent most of it telling anyone within earshot at the restaurant that her best friend had personally taken down an embezzler with a spreadsheet and sheer spite, a description I have decided not to correct, mostly because it is, on balance, extremely accurate. Odalise sends me a card every year on the anniversary of the audit, which she refers to, with the specific dry humor of a woman who has seen 100 cases and remembers the good ones fondly, as our little anniversary, and which I have started looking forward to more than my actual birthday. I hired Gary's cousin, an unnervingly competent recent graduate named Priyanka, as my first official hire once the VP title came through, and made it a point, on her first day, to walk her through every single line of the department's forecasting model myself, out loud, in front of the whole team, so that nobody, not her, not the next Chase who inevitably wanders in through a family connection, not anyone, ever has to spend 4 years being the invisible person who makes the numbers work, while somebody else's name goes on the door. And I am, as of this writing, 6 months into the actual, official, correctly titled job of VP of Finance, with a salary that finally reflects 4 years of work nobody bothered to notice, a mug on my desk that reads "World's Okayest Employee" and has become, entirely against its original intention, a small, private joke about exactly how thoroughly that particular narrative got corrected, and a specific, hard-won understanding that competence, left quiet and unclaimed for long enough, does not go noticed on its own. Sometimes it takes a stuck bag of pretzels, a boss's nephew who can't do 2-digit addition, $2.3 million, and one very patient, very furious woman with a spreadsheet, to finally make the numbers add up the way they should have all along. I keep the original spreadsheet, the real one, Marv, full timeline, backed up in 3 places, still, out of habit, and something closer to superstition. Not because I think I'll need it again. Just because it turns out to be a genuinely excellent reminder, on the days when a new hire's uncle starts looking a little too comfortable behind a closed office door, that I already know exactly what to do about it. There is a plaque on the wall by the elevator now, next to the framed photo of Diane cutting a ribbon at the company's 10th anniversary, that reads Employee of the Year, updated every January with a new name in a small brass slot. This year, for the first time in the company's history, the committee, Diane, 2 board members, and, in a twist I still find genuinely funny, Chase, who insisted on being included, voted unanimously, before nominations had even formally opened, and I walked past it every morning for the better part of a month before I let myself actually stop and read it properly. It's a small thing, in the end. A brass slot, a laminated card, a title that means considerably less than the number on my paycheck now does. But I stood there one Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, reading my own name under glass, and thought about a version of myself 6 months earlier, sitting alone at 11 p.m. with a spreadsheet and a very cold, very calm kind of fury, and decided that some plaques, however small, are worth exactly what they say they are. Looking back, losing that promotion was the best thing that ever happened to me. If I'd gotten the title I wanted, I might never have uncovered what was really happening inside that company, or realized how little they valued the person keeping everything together. Eventually, the truth came out. The audit revealed exactly what I'd warned them about, and the people who ignored my work had to answer for every decision they made. As for me, I walked away with something far more valuable than a promotion, my confidence, my reputation, and a career built on my own terms. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't getting even. It's succeeding after everyone underestimated you. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever been overlooked, remember, your hard work always has value, even when the wrong people fail to see it.